You're listening to the Meet the Farmers podcast with me, your host, Ben Eagle. Please remember to subscribe to the show wherever you are listening. Welcome to episode 254 of Meet the Farmers. I'm your host, Ben Eagle. This week, like last, we'll be dipping into the Meet the Farmers archive, looking back on some past interviews. Don't forget, you can listen to any of our archive shows at any point. Just scroll back through the podcast feed. And I'd love to know what your favourite episode is as well. Drop me an email at ben@ruralpodmedia.co.uk or message me on Twitter or Insta at MTF_podcast. First up today, we're profiling one of the most incredible human stories that I think we've had on the podcast. It's Wilfred Emmanuel-Jones, who appeared on the show in September 2022 for episode 169. I first met today's guest and I saw him speak at the Cultivate conference near Macclesfield earlier this year. He's one of these people that both the story and the way he presents it, you cannot help but being captivated by him. And I really hope that you will see that today. Wilfred Emmanuel-Jones, MBE, aka the Black Farmer, is my guest today. He farms in the southwest of England near the Devon-Cornwall border. And he founded the Black Farmer brand, through which he markets a wide range of food and drink, and indeed non-food and drink products as well, which are available online and some through the major supermarkets. Wilfred was born in Jamaica and came over to the UK with his family at an early age, growing up in inner city Birmingham. Jumping ahead to his working life, he became a chef before talking his way into working into television. We'll hear that story today, rising to become a producer and director for the BBC. And he's credited with bringing many of the top celebrity chefs to the small screen, including Gordon Ramsay, Anthony Worrell-Thompson, and James Martin. In 1994, he founded a food and drink marketing agency in London, which went on to run successful marketing campaigns for Lloyd Grossman sauces, Kettle Crisps, Plymouth Gin, and many more challenger brands. He bought his 26-acre farm in West Devon in 2000, and the Black Farmer brand soon followed. He has an immense passion for improving inclusion and diversity in farming and paving the path for greater opportunities for younger people coming into agriculture. His New Faces for Farming initiative, launched in partnership with Writtle University College earlier this year, is all about encouraging more diversity into farming. And indeed, his brand tagline, "Without Frontiers," encapsulates his drive to ensure more people have the chance to live and work in rural areas. Wilfred was awarded an MBE for services to farming in the 2020 New Year's Honours List. He's a governor of the Royal Agricultural University in Cirencester. Back in 2012, he was awarded an honorary doctorate in marketing by Plymouth University. And in 2021, he was awarded an honorary degree for distinction in the farming industry from Writtle University College in Essex. It is an absolute privilege and honour to have him on the podcast. And Wilfred, I don't think I've actually had either as long an introduction as that for anyone, but also as distinguished an introduction as well. Welcome to Meet the Farmers, and let us know how your week's been.
Well, I tell you what, thank you very much for such a fantastic introduction. I'm sitting here thinking that guy sounds really interesting. Oh,
who's that then?
Who's that then? I like to sort of hear your story. So, I'm sure that flattery is designed to sort of soften everybody up before they go into the sort of the nitty-gritty of the conversation. But
I can tell. Well, we can all tell you've been a man who's worked in television.
But I mean, as I was saying before we started to record this, that I'm here suffering from COVID. In a sense, it's the first time I've got COVID, and I'm one of those on the vulnerable list. I've had 5 of the boosters because I had acute myeloid leukemia about 8 years ago, and that's a pretty brutal illness to have, and therefore I have a compromised immune system. So I was always quite nervous about getting COVID. But if this was television, people could see that I'm still sitting upright and I'm still being able to sort of function. So thank God for the vaccine, because it's been tough, but it would have been pretty awful without it. But I've been looking forward to having this conversation with you. So I just thought, right, Wilfred, get out of your sick bed and do your job and have a chat to Ben. So that's fine. Yeah.
Honestly, thank you so much for coming on. I know lots of the listeners will know exactly what COVID is like when you get it, and certainly, so it's massively appreciated you being here. Let's start at the beginning, which is of course a very good place to start. Tell us about your very early life in Jamaica and when and why your family moved to the UK.
Yeah, you did give a very good introduction, but just to put a bit more flesh on the bone, as it were, I was born in a place called Frankfield, Clarendon. And what is really interesting about that is this. It's a very rural part of Jamaica.
Okay.
And if you go there today, you'd see farmers working the land. And in fact, what a lot of people don't realize is that a lot of people who came to this country during the 50s, because I am of the Windrush generation, came from rural backgrounds, came from farming backgrounds, and that when they had the opportunity to come to the UK, they went to where the work was. That happened to be in the towns and cities. But I've always felt that farming has always been part of my DNA, as it were, as it is for a lot of people from immigrant backgrounds, but they really didn't have the opportunity to go into farming. And in my case, we as a family were brought up in a place called Small Heath in Birmingham.
Yep.
And my mum and dad came over first. And what was traditional in those days is that then my sister and I then joined them several years later. So the first time I saw my mum and dad was when I was about 4 years old. And we lived in a place called Small Heath. And Small Heath is one of those classic inner city areas which is devoid of hope, opportunity. It's the pits. And even today, it's been somewhat 50 years since I left the place, and it still sends shivers down my spine just remembering what a horrible environment it was to be brought up in that sort of in that area.
Yeah, and you were one of 9.
Yeah, so I've got 8 brothers and sisters. And 11 of us living in a 2-up, 2-down terrace house.
Yeah.
Wow. Really cramped. 3 to a bed, outside toilets. We were very poor. My mother had to try and feed all 11 of us with one chicken. And this is one of these sort of old boiler chickens that took weeks to tenderize.
Wow.
And when I look back at that time in my life, it was a pretty miserable time. There's nothing romantic about it at all. And as a way of supplementing the family income, my father had an allotment. And in a sense, the allotment really became my oasis away from the misery of being brought up in that sort of environment. And so those of us who are lucky to live in rural Britain, we need to thank God that we are not brought up in some of the environments that some city dwellers find themselves in.
Yeah.
Because I can remember as an 11-year-old boy, I loved this sense of space that I felt when I was on my father's allotment. And I had some sort of purpose in terms of having to look after the vegetables, watering, nurturing, actually watching something grow, seeing the fruits of your labor.
Yep.
And for me, it was a really important time. Everything that I subsequently did with my life was to try and get into a position to buy a farm. Now, one of the things that I'm really doing a lot of campaigning about is that if you are from a immigrant background, the chances of you owning land, unless you're very, very rich, are impossible. Because most farmers have their land handed down through the generations.
Exactly.
Or they're lucky enough to have, earned a lot of money. And so what it then means is that if you're from my background, the chances of getting to farming are impossible. But there is a way that it could be achieved, because as well as land by being owned privately, there are a lot of institutions that own a lot of land, be that the National Trust, be that the Church of England.
Church of England, yeah.
Universities, tons and tons of different institutions, English Heritage own land. And then what they do, these institutions, is they have their land agents, and these land agents then rent it out to traditional farming backgrounds. And so our industry is not getting any diversity because it's impossible for diversity to come in because they don't have access to land. And one of the things I'm saying is that if we truly want to make rural Britain a lot more diverse, I'd be calling on these institutions to be saying to their land agents, look, let's set aside, I don't know, 1, 2, 3% of the land that we own that is specifically designed for new entrants into farming, people from non-traditional farming backgrounds, so they can have access to land. And until that happens, we're never going to bring any change, and we're never going to innovate, because it's outsiders that innovate. It's outsiders that see opportunities. And the criticism about our industry is that it's slow, that there's a lot more that we could be doing if we had different ideas. Yeah. And it's something I think we could all be doing a lot more to try and achieve.
Let's put the pause button on your story for a minute, because I just want to delve a little bit more into this. When you have sort of those conversations with either land agents or those big institutions, as you say, what kind of response are you getting personally?
Well, what's happened in I call it the food and farming industry. The food and farming industry has really got away with murder, because change comes about by the demands of urban Britain. And urban Britain decides that something becomes a political issue, you then see change. Now, because farming has been seen as an industry, as for thickos or stupid people, I think there's this conflict between urban and rural Britain that we've managed to be under the radar, that a lot of people in urban Britain really have not twigged that the power is with land. And the two most vitally important things in our lives are sleep and food. And I think that there is now a change happening where actually urban Britain are now starting to ask these sort of questions and demand more from these institutions, that they should be doing things to help to bring about change. Because when I've had conversations with these institutions, they're not really interesting. They're not going to change unless somebody forces them to change. Every change we've had within our food chain, whether that's free range, whether that's battery hens, that's down to the consumer saying this is no longer acceptable. And I say, look, the foods that we import into this country that's consumed by immigrant families could be actually grown in this country if the expertise was there. So it'd be great for the economy. It's about actually us realizing, or these institutions, the government realizing, we need to do more to make this into a place of better opportunity. And if you take me, for example, I'm sort of held up as somebody that's sort of broken the mold. But in the greater scheme of things, I've only got 28 acres, that ain't, most farmers would, think that's nothing. It's just a piss in the ocean. And, you're talking about people who have thousands of acres. That's where you could then start to do something that's sort of commercially viable. Yeah. I've managed to create and because I'm a branding man, I've demonstrated what you could do with almost very little.
Exactly.
And I, one of the things I would love to see happening a lot more is that actually farmers have a much bigger relationship with their consumers, because what's happened in the past is that the supermarkets have been the gatekeepers to the relationship with the consumer. And so the consumer doesn't really have an understanding of what farming is all about. And what I've demonstrated with my brand, that if you're prepared to go out and communicate that the consumers are begging for some sort of relationship with the people who are actually producing their foods. And I would like to see a lot of farmers realize that is the future. That it's not just about doing the job, but it's reaching out, communicating with the very people who are buying your food, because they are your sales force. If you get them on side, they will be supportive. They will then help make the change.
Absolutely. And you and your journey is testimony to that. But it's like, I think we're becoming better at talking about it and saying it, but it's very different saying it and actually getting out and doing it, isn't it? And having those conversations and then getting out and actually building your own brand.
Well, yeah, I mean, look, we have to be honest about the industry. The industry is in desperate need for change.
Yeah.
And that we've got away with it because actually we have not had enough people challenging what farming is all about. Now, if somebody made me an agricultural minister, the first thing that I would demand is that all the farmers' names should be on food products, or it should be, just so we start to get the urban Britain actually linking the food that they eat from real people who are producing that. For me, we're putting a lot more emphasis in actually the farmers being front of face to the consumer. So there's some way of sort of engaging it. Absolutely important. I would demand that every single child goes and visits school once a year. It's part of the sort of the curriculum.
Yep.
What I think is that if anything has, the big lessons that we are now being taught is that this reliance on globalization has now come and kicked us in the teeth. And then actually what we need to do is that we need to look after our own resources and to get a lot more people making it so that we could be self-sufficient, that rather than what we've done in the past is thinking that because we could get it cheaply done in these countries like Russia and Ukraine, look where we are now. And that needs to be a life lesson that actually we need to spend a lot more time, effort and resources in being self-reliant, being really connecting with urban Britain. I would say, for example, one of the crises that we have at the moment about getting people to go and work on farms and to help with harvesting. One of the things like if a student goes to Australia, for example, if they go and work on a farm for 3 months or 6 months, they could then get an extended visa to stay longer. We should be having schemes like that in this country. We should be saying to students, right, if you go and spend 6 months and working on a farm and do that, that will, some money off your student loan will come off. We need to be a lot more imaginative to invite new blood rather than what we've done in the past is relying on cheap labor, people doing it because they have no alternative. So if we start doing that, I think A, we're going to attract new blood. B, we're going to get people seeing that farming is an essential part of life. And we're going to be celebrated just like the cult of the celebrity chefs. It was the celebrity chefs that made catering an honorable profession for young people to go into. They just thought, oh, I could do that. We need to do exactly the same thing with farming. Rather than thinking it's these old, bloody, frosty white men, it's got to be somewhere that's glamorous, that's interesting, that's going to attract new blood.
Yeah.
And that is when we're going to see a much better balance between urban and rural in this country.
My brain is working overtime in terms of where I want to take this conversation, but let's go back to your story first. I want to return to some of those questions later on, but take us back to so very early career for you. You became a chef. Tell me briefly about that time and then how that led on to next stages.
Well, my life. I don't want my life to seem romantic because it wasn't. My life was shit to start off with. Because I was brought up in Saul Heath in Birmingham. I went to the local secondary modern school, they were called then, and it's for people who failed their 11 plus. I am dyslexic, and then so I spent most of my time at school not understanding what the hell was going on. I could hardly read and write. And school for me was a miserable, horrible place. And one of my other passions is dyslexia, because dyslexia is a gift.
Yep.
And it's only now as I've got older that I recognize that it's a gift. But, it was pretty miserable living with dyslexia when I was younger. And even today, a lot of young people have a pretty miserable time because there still isn't any understanding of dyslexia and the gift that dyslexia is. And especially a lot of people, again, in the farming community, they tend to be sort of written off. And so I left school at the age of 16, and I wanted to get away from home. Because, 3 to a bed ain't that bloody comfortable. So I joined the army. And again, not because I had any desires to be a military man. It's just that, I was...
It got you out.
Yeah. I was as thick as shit. I couldn't, what else could you do? Chuck him in the army. But in those days, if you're a black guy with a mouthy attitude, one or two things were going to happen. you were either going to shut the fuck up and do as you're told, or you're going to get your head kicked in and get chucked out. So I got my head kicked in and chucked out. So, at the age of 18, everything you would probably expect to happen to a black kid from my background, I seem to be on course to ending up in prison, ending up on society's dustbin heap. And what was really interesting in those days, if you're a failure at everything, and they think, oh, what the hell could we do with them? They put you into catering because they thought, well, shit, he could peel potatoes and wash up dishes. So that's how I ended up in catering, not again because of the desires, because, well, what the hell can he do?
Okay.
So that's how I ended up. And I went to the local catering college, and luckily I took to it. I took to catering. But one of the things I say to young people is this: the most important. Well, you don't have to be young. It's something I think you need to have in your whole life. Is that you need to find out what is your personal purpose. Mm-hmm. If you do not know what your personal purpose is, your life is that of surviving. Mm-hmm. And there's nothing more miserable of an existence than a life of surviving. So in all of the time that I was living my life and doing all these different things, the one purpose that always kept me driving and motivating forward was to one day own my own farm. Yep. It kept me absolutely focused. And I absolutely fundamentally believe that you need to have in the back of mind your personal purpose, and everything you do needs to be actually aimed towards fulfilling that personal purpose. So I when I interview people for jobs, and I've just done a series rounds of interviews at the moment, the question that always flummoxes them is when I say, what is your personal purpose? Because most people don't know. I said, I'm not really interested in employing somebody because for a job, they need to be thinking, well, this job is here to help me fulfill my personal purpose. And that's more than just putting bread on the table. It's got to be something deeper than that.
Absolutely. And it's something, like you say, most of us are pretty terrible, actually, even spending any time, even thinking about that, let alone knowing what it is.
Yeah, it's really, really important because, in order to give your life worth and value, it doesn't really matter what it is, but you need to know why you're doing it. Otherwise, there's nothing more traumatic than survival mode, really. Yeah. And again, so my story is someone from society's dustbin heap who has managed to fulfill his purpose, because all you've got to do is have the stamina to keep going and to keep believing. We live in an age where people want instant success. It ain't. Life's a marathon, and it just keep going. And also, I don't know if you're going to go on to this, because, in order to buy this farm, even though I qualified as a chef, I'm not one of these big glamorous chefs. I mean, I was flipping burgers, so it's the bottom end of it. And I did that for a number of years. But I knew that if I was ever going to buy my own farm, I was never going to do that flipping burgers. I would need to do something bold.
I really recommend that you go and listen to all of that episode if you haven't already. That's episode 169 with Wilfred Emmanuel-Jones. Next up is another episode from 2022 with Anna Jones, who is a farmer's daughter, journalist, broadcaster, and the founder of Just Farmers, as well as the author of the book Divide. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I enjoyed recording it. Today on the show, I am really pleased to say that I have broadcaster, journalist, and founder of Just Farmers, Anna Jones, with me. Anna is here to tell us all about her upcoming book, Divide, the relationship crisis between town and country, which is available in all the usual places from March the 3rd. The book is highly personal, but also adept in terms of exploring the bigger picture. Anna tells us her story of growing up on a small farm to moving to the city to follow through with her journalism career ambitions. She explores the perceived disparities between town and country, but also looks for common ground, which is always an important aspiration in my mind. For me personally, it was really interesting reading about someone who shared my own experience in my head. This urban-rural personal divide. So I have friends in town and country, and having lived for some years in Bristol, and now back on the family farm in Essex, I too really share this personal rural-urban divide in terms of understanding my own identity. So it was absolutely fascinating reading this book, and we haven't even started the interview yet. But honestly, guys, please go out, pre-order it, and if you're listening to this after March the 3rd, please order a copy as well, because it is really fascinating. As it says on the book sleeve, this book will surely start conversations, which I hope it will. Anna, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for inviting me on. Like another bucket list. Yeah, on Meet the Farmers. Wow.
Well, as you can tell, I'm probably quite excited. I'm probably more excited than you are to have you.
I think we're both pretty excited.
I think so. I've given a brief intro, mostly to the book there, but obviously the book is a lot about you as well. But can you introduce yourself to listeners? I know that many listeners will already know of you and your work.
Well, first of all, thank you for introducing it so brilliantly and for plugging the book like that. And I'm really pleased that that it resonated with you, Ben, because that's kind of what I was aiming for. So yeah, a bit about me. My name's Anna. I grew up on a small family beef and sheep farm right on the border between England and Wales, near Oswestry in Shropshire, and went to university, studied journalism, kind of knew at a freakishly young age that that's what I wanted to be. And kind of once I do set my mind on things, I tend to be quite focused. And then I went to do journalism at uni and then worked in newspapers as a reporter in general news, sort of door knocking for a few years, and then knew that I wanted to somehow bring farming into my journalism career. And that's when I sort of started banging on the door of the BBC. 2006, got a job on Country File, spent 12 years at the BBC, working on various rural affairs programmes, from Country File to Farming Today to On Your Farm on Radio 4, and then went freelance. And as you've mentioned, off the back of my Nuffield scholarship, which looked at the coverage of agriculture in the media and the relationship there that isn't always positive, I decided to set up something to try and help. And Just Farmers is my small way of trying to build bridges between an urban media and a rural farming population. And I think all of this whole experience is what's led to the book.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned there that you knew what you wanted to do from quite an early age, which not everyone has. Why, do you think?
It's not a cool answer, unfortunately. Do you remember those PSC lessons that you used to have in school? Yeah. So we had a teacher that came in and was going around the class and asking what everyone wanted to be. And I knew I wanted to be some kind of city power woman. And I had this, I think I'd watched a lot of 80s movies. And, in the 80s, it was all about power dressing women. And it was quite a feminist time. And as a young, impressionable, 8-9-year-old or whatever, watching these women, I was always like, I want to stride around Manhattan in heels. I want to be like that. And so I always thought I was going to be a lawyer, because that's the ultimate striding around in heels job. And then that PSC lesson, I remember one of the girls in my class said that she wanted to be a journalist. And it was the first time I'd ever heard that word, journalist, out loud. But I remember thinking, oh my God, that's me. I love talking. I love asking questions. I'm very, very nosy, and I love writing. And I remember I nicked the idea off a girl in class. Like, that's so not cool, is it? But that is the truth.
And then fast forward several years, and like I say, you've outlined your career so far in that, and so many highlights in that. But I mean, why do you think you struggled to reconcile that direction that you've been so determined to go down with your rural upbringing?
My rural upbringing was something that I really took for granted when I was a child. And I think that was for lots of reasons. One, at that time, 1990s, farming was having a very, very difficult time. And Dad did not encourage any of us, me nor my two sisters, to go into farming. In fact, he actively discouraged it. Yep. And, he wanted us to explore the world. He wanted us to get an education, get educated. He used to say that all the time, go and do something else. And Mum was very adventurous as well, and was all about kind of go out there and, have adventures. And the school that I was in never encouraged agriculture either, or it really never acknowledged that we were rural kids growing up in an agricultural community. It kind of wanted to push you away from it. If you showed any kind of academic ability, I remember that subtle pressure from the teachers of you go to university, you go. So I think there was that kind of pushed me away from my rural life. And then I eventually ended up, I was quite old when I moved to a city for the first time. I was 25 when I moved to Birmingham. And because Preston, where I went to uni, wasn't a city when I was in uni, it was still a town.
Yeah.
And so 25, ended up in Birmingham, and I just had the best time.
Yeah.
For a couple of years, I kind of forgot home, really.
Okay.
I really threw myself into it. And the only time I ever really went to the countryside was when I went to music festivals. And, so I really, really embraced urban life. And I didn't realize that I was changing. And I think very, very subtly changing. And I felt when I went home, a sort of formality had sprung up between people that I had known all my life, like in my community. Like we used to talk so freely, we'd pass each other on the road and wind the window down on the lane and have a good old chin wag. But suddenly people were more formal around me or less familiar. And I suddenly realized, I was like, oh my God, I'm not part of this community anymore. People are different around me. People think that I'm different. And you know what? I probably am different. And, I'd stopped going to Young Farmers. I stopped going to the Royal Welsh Show, socializing with young country people. I wasn't doing it as much as I used to. And it was like a door had clicked shut behind me. And I started to feel like I was losing a part of myself. And I know that might sound dramatic, but I'm sure there must be other people that have felt that. And because you do change moving to a city. And not just that, the people in your community, in your farming community, look at you differently because you've moved to the city.
Yeah.
And I had this conversation with Matt Naylor, flower grower from Lincolnshire. And he was saying, it's true. You see these people that go off and have their life in the city and they come back and the community does look at them differently. Yeah. They don't quite fit in the same way anymore. And that was a great sadness to me, probably more than a sadness. It was kind of an anxiety and a panic. And that's one of the reasons I went for my Nuffield scholarship and applied, because I was trying to get something back that I felt like I was in danger of losing. So that's why I did struggle, as you say, to sort of reconcile those two identities. I think that was the beginning of that struggle, with that recognition that I was changing.
Yeah, I mean, so much that resonates with me. And both, especially at school and also growing up on, we were a dairy farm in the 90s, end of the MMB. And it was a terrible time on the farm. And so much so that, me and my sister back then, we were definitely got the feeling. I don't think we were ever came up as a conversation, but I felt massively discouraged, definitely from both going into the family business, but also just agriculture generally. I don't think it even featured as even a prospect. It was always go and do something else, make something else with your life. And then similarly, how you were saying when you moved to Birmingham, I know when I moved to Bristol, and definitely for that first sort of few years, I completely get that as well. You don't even think, but it was strangely for me, it was actually moving away that then reattracted me to that rural heritage. And it was that actually got me back out onto farms. I started doing lots of volunteering in conservation, then I ended up going into conservation as well for a time. But it's fascinating how when you experience both sides, and this is one of the things I love about the book, it actually makes you think about that, which we don't really think about generally. It makes you think about both those sides. Anyway, I'm rambling. Let's go back to you.
No, I love hearing it because you're right. People don't talk about it. It has been overlooked and it's never consciously acknowledged, which I think is a mistake. And that's why I love talking about it and hearing your experiences, Ben, because it's kind of been, when it's reflected back at you from other people's experiences, you think, oh God, this isn't just me. This is a thing. This is a cultural difference that actually it's important to acknowledge it. And it's important to acknowledge that there are different identities that go with being an urban person or a rural person. So no, I'm fascinated to hear your experiences.
So you explore your family history in the opening chapter, and a lot of the book is highly personal. In a latter chapter, for example, you write about your pregnancy, for example. why was it important for you to make this a personal book? And I suppose why did you want to write it?
Why is it so personal? And it's important to write about what you know and what you feel, because the issues in the book are deeply, deeply personal to me. And I wasn't sure that I could really show the divide unless I showed how it had affected me.
Okay.
And I suppose by opening myself up, I hope that the book will encourage people to open themselves up as well, and to maybe have a little look inside and think, oh, have I experienced some of these uncomfortable feelings? Like you said, it, resonated with you. I was writing the book when I got pregnant and also lost the baby. And, all of that happened while I was writing the book.
Oh, wow.
And so it was almost, I was writing in real time. Yeah. And it was such a huge thing in my life. And as you read in the book, it kind of led me to meet people who had hugely relevant things to say about this. It was all sort of tied up. And I also wrote it in lockdown. So when you're kind of, I had a miscarriage in that January 2021 hard lockdown, totally cut off from my family and friends.
Gosh, Anna.
Like, it was very, very difficult. And all I really had to pour myself into was the book. But that's not, I don't feel bad about that. And that's certainly not a negative. I think in some ways it was cathartic to be able to share that. But ultimately it is about write what you know. And that's always been drilled into me all through my career is, write what you know about, write what you're passionate about, and that will translate, and other people will hopefully be infected by that enthusiasm and enjoy reading it.
Yeah, absolutely. I hope they will too. I'm sure they will. There is loads packed into it, and I don't want to give too many spoilers away. But I imagine there was, in fact, I know there was a lot that didn't make the cut, which is always the bit that interests me. And I don't know how much your publishers will allow you to say. But what were some of those things that you wrote about that didn't make it through?
I was asked to write a 60,000 word book. Guess how many words I submitted?
I'm guessing almost double, probably, being you.
107,000 words. See, too much time on
editor's
my hands.
Nightmare.
Yeah, it was. I know when they gave me the contract and it said 60,000 words, I remember thinking, oh my God, I'm never going to be able to write that much. But as soon as I started writing, it all just came spilling out. So rather than salami slicing through the whole book, one of the things that the publisher decided to do was take out a whole chapter. They just took out a whole chapter, which was called Culture. There was a culture chapter in there.
Right.
And the culture chapter looked at fashion, country clothing and streetwear. It talked about how we converse. It talked about the culture of the livestock markets. It talked a lot about country sports, actually. There was a lot on shooting and hunting and things in that chapter. And in the end, it was a difficult decision, but I think they thought, some of the other chapters are really quite, we've got politics, we've got environment, we've got food, these are big, big issues. And they're like, it felt a little trite compared to everything else. It was it was a little bit of a more light-hearted chapter. And I'm going to take some of it and put it into blogs because I wouldn't want that work to be wasted. But, Matt Naylor, who I've spoken about, the flower grower in Lincolnshire and the co-founder of AgRespect, he featured heavily in the culture chapter. And he's such a witty guy. One of the things we were talking about, clothes that farmers wear. And I was sad that this didn't make it into the book, actually. And he said to me, he was like, why do farmers have to wear somber looking clothes? And he was like, you go to the livestock markets and it's a sea of kind of muted green.
That's such a Matt thing to say. Yeah.
Like they dress the colour of a hedgerow in winter. And it was just like, yes, they do. And it's like, why? And then he said to me, he's like, can you imagine if you turned up at the auction wearing a ski jacket like John Craven, like a bright red ski jacket? And he was like, people would look at you because you should wear a somber looking coat. We're farmers. And so anyway, I thought it was those kind of conversations that didn't make it into the final cut.
Yeah. Okay. And the final title, of course, Divide. I suppose why that title, and were there any alternative titles, and what conclusion did you come to?
I suppose a more accurate name for the book would probably be Difference.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is, but that doesn't sound very interesting.
It's not as good a title, is it?
It doesn't sound very interesting. It doesn't really make grammatical sense either. It's just people are like, what the hell? But really, the only reason there is a divide is because we don't consciously acknowledge and respect the difference. If we just accepted the differences, there wouldn't be a divide. And divide, no, that was the first title that came up. And then that was it. There was the tagline was going to be different, and I'm really glad they changed it because it was a bit crap looking back. It was originally when I pitched the book, it was called Divide, and then it said how the town mouse and the country mouse went to war.
Okay.
But they've changed it to the relationship crisis between town and country, which is a billion times better. And I wish I'd thought of that myself. So no, but it was always going to be called Divide.
And if you want to listen to the rest of that, then you can find it on episode 142. That was with Anna-Jones. That is it for today's dig into the archive. I hope you've enjoyed it and can join me next week. But until then, have a great week ahead, and I'll see you next time.